mean I'll see it.
You know that feeling when you're in a room full of people who are just purely happy, and for a second, the world feels like it actually makes sense? That's how the Star Ballroom felt every weekend. It wasn't some high-end club with velvet ropes and overpriced drinks. It was a place for the older crowd, people who had spent their lives working manual labor or raising kids, finally getting a chance to put on their best shoes and glide across a waxed floor. My aunt was one of them. She lived for those Lunar New Year parties. She'd spend weeks picking out the right dress, something red for luck, and she'd talk about the dance steps like they were sacred rituals. I went with her that night because she didn't want to drive late, and honestly, the energy in that place was usually infectious. But looking back, the air felt different. It was heavy, like the humidity you feel right before a massive thunderstorm breaks, only the sky was clear and the neon lights of Monterey Park were buzzing just like always. We were near the back, by the refreshment tables where the smell of almond cookies and sweat mixed together. The music was loud, a classic ballroom track that sounded like something from a movie set in the 40s. Everyone was moving in synchronization, a sea of red silk and slow, deliberate steps. That's when he walked in. I didn't see him enter, but I felt this shift. It was like a cold draft had been let in from the street. I remember looking over and seeing a man who just didn't fit. He wasn't there to dance. He stood by the entrance for a heartbeat, his silhouette framed against the streetlights outside. He looked like any other grandfather you'd see at the grocery store, slight, older, wearing a jacket that looked a size too big. But his face, it was completely blank. There was no joy, no anger, just a flat, terrifying neutrality. Then the sound happened. At first, I thought a transformer had blown outside. It was a rhythmic, mechanical tearing sound. The music kept playing for a few seconds, which is the part that still keeps me up at night, the way the violins were still swelling while the first row of dancers simply folded. They didn't fall like people in movies. They collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. I saw a woman I'd seen earlier, someone's grandmother in a beautiful sequined gown, suddenly jerk backward. A spray of something dark and wet hit the white tablecloth next to me, soaking into a pile of napkins. The realization didn't hit everyone at once. There was this horrible, lingering moment of confusion where the dancers kept moving, stepping over the people who had already gone down. Then the screaming started. It wasn't a collective shout, it was a series of high, jagged punctures in the air. The man didn't say a word. He just moved with this sickening, robotic efficiency. He wasn't rushing. He was just harvesting. He'd point that heavy, dark shape in his hand, and another person would burst. I saw my aunt dive under a table, her red dress snagging on a chair, and I lunged after her. The floor was already becoming slick. It's a specific kind of cold, the way blood feels when it hits a polished floor. It loses its warmth almost instantly and turns into a lubricant that makes it impossible to find your footing. I remember pressing my face against the underside of the table, the smell of dust and old chewing gum filling my nose, while the world above us turned into a slaughterhouse. I could see his shoes. Polished black shoes, moving slowly past the table legs. Every time he stopped, there was that deafening crack, 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 followed by the wet thud of bodies hitting the wood. I watched a man's hand reach out from under the neighboring table, his fingers twitching, trying to find something to hold on to. He was wearing a gold wedding band that caught the light of the disco ball. Then, a pair of black shoes stepped right next to that hand, and the sound came again. The hand went limp, and a slow, thick ribbon of deep crimson began to snake toward me, winding its way around the table legs like a living thing. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The music finally cut out, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the rhythmic clack of the shooter reloading. That was the worst part, the silence. In that silence, you could hear the sounds of the dying. It wasn't like crying. It was a wet, bubbly whistling sound, the sound of air escaping chests that couldn't hold it anymore. I kept my eyes locked on my aunt. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at a discarded red envelope that had fallen near her face. It was a lucky envelope, meant to hold money for the new year. Now, it was being slowly submerged in a rising tide of dark fluid. The shooter eventually just left. He didn't run. He walked out the same way he came in, leaving the door swinging behind him. For a long time, nobody moved. We were all terrified he was waiting. Just outside the frame of the door, waiting for the survivors to poke their heads out. When I finally crawled out from under that table, the room didn't look like the Star Ballroom anymore. It looked like a butcher shop after a frantic shift. The smell was the first thing that broke me. It's metallic, heavy, and sweet in a way that makes your stomach turn inside out. I saw people I recognized from the neighborhood, people who had been laughing and talking about their grandkids 10 minutes prior. They were unrecognizable. The human body is so fragile when it's met with that kind of force. There were things on the floor that shouldn't have been out in the light. I saw a man trying to hold his own side together, his hands drenched, his eyes looking at me with a terrifying, vacant plea. I tried to help, but where do you even start when the floor is a lake of red and everyone is screaming for someone who isn't coming back? The police arrived, and then the sirens, and then the cameras. But the mystery of it is what lingers, rotting in the back of my mind. He was 72 years old. He was one of them. He had danced on that floor before. He knew the names of the people he was erasing. They say it was a grudge, something about his wife or his past at the studio, but that doesn't explain the coldness of it. It doesn't explain why he chose that specific night, a night of renewal and luck, to turn a sanctuary into a grave. He killed himself the next day, cornered in a van, taking whatever twisted reason he had to the dirt. We're left with the why, and the why is a hole that never fills up. I still can't look at red envelopes. I can't listen to ballroom music without hearing that rhythmic, mechanical tearing sound. Sometimes, when I'm in a crowded room, I find myself staring at the entrance, waiting for a slight, older man in an oversized jacket to step into the light. Because the scariest thing about it wasn't that he was a monster. The scariest thing was how much he looked like everyone else's grandfather. He was just a man who decided that his pain was worth more than everyone else's lives, and he had the tools to prove it. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back under that table. I'm watching those polished black shoes move through the red puddles. I'm waiting for the sound to stop, but in my head, it never does. It just keeps echoing, a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm of lead hitting bone, over and over, until the music starts again.
Next story.
You ever have that feeling where the air just gets too thick to breathe? Not because of the heat, but because the silence in a room feels heavy? Like the walls are leaning in, trying to listen to your heartbeat. I heard this story from a guy who used to live in one of those old housing blocks, the kind where the hallways are long and dark, and everyone knows everyone else's business. Except for this one time. This one time, nobody saw a thing, and it still keeps me up if I think about it too long. It started on a morning that felt just like any other. The humidity was already at that point where your clothes stick to your back the second you step out of bed. A mother and father lived in a small, cramped apartment with their kids. They were good people, hardworking, just trying to make ends meet in a city that was growing faster than they could keep up with. Every morning, the parents would head out to work, leaving the older kids to watch the younger ones until it was time for school. It was a routine. It was safe. Back then, you didn't think twice about leaving your kids alone for an hour or two. The neighbors were right there, the door was locked, and the world felt smaller, more manageable. But that morning, something shifted. The mother left for work, walking down those concrete stairs, hearing the echoes of her own footsteps. She didn't feel a pair of eyes on her back. She didn't see the shadow tucked into the corner of the stairwell, waiting for the sound of her bus to pull away. Everything was normal until it wasn't. Later that morning, when the parents tried to call home to check in, Just a quick check to make sure the kids had gotten ready for school. The phone just rang. And rang. And rang. It's that sound, you know? That hollow, repetitive ringing that starts to sound like a warning after a while. The mother felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she brushed it off. Maybe they were just playing. Maybe they'd already left. But the knot stayed there, cold and hard. When the father finally got back to the apartment, the first thing he noticed wasn't a sound. It was the silence. The apartment was usually a chaotic mess of laughter and arguing, the way it is when you have a house full of life. But this silence, it was different. It was the kind of quiet that follows a scream. He walked through the living area, calling their names. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The bedrooms were empty. Then he saw the bathroom door. It was closed, but there was something dark and wet seeping out from under the wood, soaking into the grout of the floor tiles. It looked like spilled ink at first, but the smell hit him before he could reach the handle. It was the smell of a butcher shop that had been left in the sun, metallic, sweet, and thick enough to taste. He pushed the door open, and that's when the world ended for him. They were all in there. All of them. They weren't just killed, they were dismantled. The person who did it didn't use a gun or something quick. They used a blade, something heavy and sharp, and they had taken their time. The kids were piled on top of one another in the small space, a tangled mess of limbs and shredded clothing. The walls were painted red, almost up to the ceiling, where the spray had hit with such force that it had dripped back down like rain. The worst part, the part the guy told me that made my skin crawl, was that they were hacked so badly that you could barely tell where one child ended and the other began. There were countless deep, jagged tears in their small bodies. It wasn't just a murder, it was an erasure. It was as if someone wanted to turn these children back into nothing but raw meat. And the killer, he hadn't just left them there. He had washed himself. The sink was still damp, stained with a faint pink residue where he'd calmly rinsed the blood off his hands and face before walking right back out the front door and into the crowded hallway. The police came, of course. They tore the place apart looking for a lead. There was no forced entry. Whoever did this had been invited in, or had a key. They had waited for the parents to leave, and they had walked in like they belonged there. They interviewed hundreds of people. Neighbors said they heard nothing, maybe a few thuds, but they figured it was just kids playing, jumping off furniture. Nobody heard a scream. That's the detail that gets me. How do you do that to a house full of children without a single person in the next apartment hearing a scream? The parents were destroyed. They moved out, obviously. You can't live in a place where the floorboards are stained with your own family's blood. They tried to move on, though you don't really move on from something like that. You just exist in the ruins of your life. But the horror didn't stop at the apartment. A couple of weeks later, just as the neighborhood was starting to prepare for the new year, a card arrived in the mail. It was one of those. Bright, colorful cards with pictures of happy kids playing, the kind you send to friends to wish them a long life and many children. The mother opened it, her hands probably trembling, thinking maybe it was a sympathy card from a distant relative. But inside, there was a message. It was written in a neat, practiced hand. It mocked them. It told them that they would never have any more offspring now. It ended with a ha-ha, as if the entire thing, the butchery, the blood, the screams that nobody heard, was just a punchline to a long, cruel joke. It was signed, simply, the murderer. That's when they realized the person who did it wasn't some random lunatic. It was someone who knew them. Someone who had watched them, who knew their schedule, who knew exactly how many children they had and exactly how to hurt them the most. Someone who was probably standing in the crowd when the bodies were carried out, watching the parents wail on the street, enjoying every second of it. To this day, they never found him. He's out there somewhere, maybe an old man now, sitting in a coffee shop or walking through a park, looking at other families and remembering the way the blade felt when it hit bone. He walked away with the blood of an entire family on his soul and just disappeared. Sometimes I think about that card. I think about the person who sat down at a table, picked up a pen, and wrote those words while the ink on the police reports was still wet. It makes you look at your neighbors differently. It makes you wonder about the person who smiles at you in the elevator or the stranger who holds the door open for you. Because sometimes, the person who knows you best is the one who wants to see you broken. And sometimes, they're just waiting for the house to go quiet so they can finish the joke.
Next story.
I don't think people really understand how quickly a room can turn into a tomb. We like to think we'd be the ones to find a way out, that we keep our heads while everyone else lost theirs, but that is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. My grandfather lived through the fire at the 61st Regiment farm, and the way he described it, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mechanical, systematic slaughter caused by nothing more than a few sparks and a lot of heavy chains. He was a young man then, stationed out in the middle of nowhere in Xinjiang. It was the Lunar New Year, and for a group of soldiers and their families out on a remote military farm, that was the only night of the year that actually mattered. Everyone was packed into the regiment's theater. It was a massive, drafty building, mostly wood and old concrete, decorated with these huge, elaborate paper wreaths to honor the holiday and the fallen. Hundreds of children were there, sitting on the floor in the aisles because the wooden seats were already overflowing. They were all waiting for the movie to start, buzzing with that high-pitched energy only kids have. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cigarettes and the faint, cold scent of the winter outside leaking through the cracks. Then, a kid in the front row, just a boy, really lit a firecracker. It was supposed to be a joke, a little pop to start the celebration. But the spark didn't just fizzle out. It jumped. It hit one of those paper wreaths hanging near the stage, and because the air in that theater was so dry, the wreath didn't just burn, it detonated. Within 30 seconds, the entire front of the room was a wall of orange. My grandfather said the first thing he noticed wasn't the heat, but the sound of the oxygen being sucked out of the room. It was like a giant lung taking a breath. The movie projector was still running, casting a flickering image of a revolutionary hero onto a screen that was literally curling into ash. People didn't scream at first. There was this horrible, heavy silence where everyone just realized, all at once, that they were in a box that was currently being preheated. Then the panic hit, and it wasn't a human thing anymore. It was a stampede. My grandfather was near the back, which is the only reason he's a ghost in my family tree and not a memory. He saw the wave of people move toward the main exits. It was a sea of olive drab uniforms and bright New Year's coats worn by the children. But when the first group reached the doors, they didn't open. They pushed and they kicked and they threw their entire body weights against the wood, but the doors stayed shut. The administrators had locked them. They had chained the secondary exits from the outside to keep people from sneaking in without tickets and to keep the order of the regiment. He described the sound of the crowd hitting those locked doors as a wet, thudding noise. The people in the back didn't know the doors were locked, so they kept pushing. They were crushing the people at the front against the wood so hard that the ribs of the children were snapping like dry kindling. He told me he could hear the distinct, rhythmic popping of bones over the roar of the fire. The heat was rising so fast that the ceiling began to melt. Back then, they used a lot of tar and cheap plastic for insulation, and it started to drip down like black, boiling rain. If a drop of that stuff hit your skin, it didn't just burn you, it fused to you. He saw a woman try to wipe a glob of it off her shoulder, and it just took the skin and the muscle right off the bone with it. She didn't even scream, she just stared at her own white humerus through the smoke. The fire moved across the ceiling like a living animal, leaping from one paper wreath to the next. Every time a wreath caught, it would fall, landing on the heads of the people trapped in the aisles. It was a nightmare of fire and gravity. My grandfather realized he couldn't go for the main doors. He saw the pile of bodies starting to grow there, a literal ramp of human beings, 3, 4, 5 layers deep. People were climbing over the dying to try and reach the top of the door frames, clawing at the concrete until their fingernails were gone. He managed to find a small window high up in a storage nook near the projection booth. He had to kick the glass out, which sliced his legs to ribbons, but the adrenaline was so thick he didn't feel a thing. As he was pulling himself up, he looked back into the main hall. The smoke was so thick and black it looked like solid marble, but underneath it, the floor was a carpet of fire. The most gut-wrenching part wasn't the fire itself. It was the children. Because they were smaller, they were the first to be stepped on. They were the first to be pushed down into the gaps between the seats. He saw a soldier trying to hold a young girl above his head, trying to keep her out of the crush, but the black rain from the ceiling fell directly onto her face. She just dissolved in his hands. When he finally tumbled out of that window and hit the frozen dirt outside, he thought he was safe. But then he heard the sound from inside the building. It wasn't screaming anymore. It was a low, collective moan, hundreds of voices vibrating through the walls of the theater. It sounded like the building itself was in pain. He and a few other soldiers who had escaped through the windows tried to find access to break the chains on the outside of the main doors. They were frantic, sobbing, swinging at the iron links. When they finally broke the first set of chains and the doors swung open, they had to step back. The bodies didn't fall out. They were wedged so tightly into the doorway that they stayed upright. It was a solid wall of charred flesh and melted clothing. The person at the very front, a woman whose face had been pressed against the crack of the door for air, had been squeezed so hard by the hundreds of people behind her that her eyes had literally been pushed out of their sockets. They spent the next 3 days pulling them out. Because of the heat and the way the synthetic clothes had melted, a lot of the bodies were fused together. They couldn't tell where one person ended and the next began. They had to use saws. My grandfather was assigned to the cleanup crew, and he said the smell was something he could never wash off. It wasn't just the smell of burnt meat, it was the smell of scorched hair and the metallic tang of so much blood that it had pooled inches deep on the concrete floor, cooked into a thick, black crust. They found groups of children huddled under the stage, thinking it would protect them. They were all dead from smoke inhalation, their little hands gripped together so tightly that the soldiers had to break their fingers to separate them for burial. The government tried to keep it quiet, of course. They didn't want the world to know that 700 people had been cooked alive because of a few padlocks. They buried most of them in a mass grave, no names, just numbers on a regiment ledger. My grandfather never watched a movie in a theater again. He couldn't sit in a room if he couldn't see at least 2 ways out that weren't blocked. Toward the end of his life, when the dementia started to take hold, he'd sit in his chair and start picking at his sleeves, convinced he had that black, boiling tar on his arms. He'd tell me that the worst part wasn't the fire, and it wasn't even the locked doors. It was the fact that for weeks after the fire, when the wind blew across the farm, you could still hear the faint, high-pitched whistling of the air moving through the ruins of the theater. He said it sounded just like the children laughing before the movie started, a sound that lingered in the soil, waiting for someone to finally open the doors and let them out. I think about those doors every time I'm in a crowd. I look at the exits. I look at the chains. And I wonder how many layers of people I'd be if the room started to breathe.
Next story.
I've never been the type to talk about what happened back then, mostly because people look at you differently when they realize you've seen the world peel back its skin. They think they want to hear a story about the war, but they don't. They want a movie. They want heroes. They don't want the reality of what it's like when a holiday meant for peace turns into a literal slaughterhouse, and they definitely don't want to hear about the things that weren't quite human in the smoke. It was the peak of the Lunar Festival. You have to understand the atmosphere to get why we were so off guard. The air was thick, like you could reach out and grab a handful of it. It smelled like incense, expensive cooking oils, and those little paper firecrackers everyone was tossing into the streets. There was supposed to be a truce. Everyone knew it. It was the one time of the year where the fighting was supposed to just stop. We actually believed that. We were sitting in this small villa on the edge of the city, just a group of us who had managed to snag some decent food and a few bottles of something that burned going down. The celebration was everywhere. You could hear the music from the center of town drifting over the walls, and the sky was constantly flickering with the light of the fireworks. But then, the sound changed. It wasn't a sudden transition, which is the part that still messes with my head. It was gradual. The rhythmic popping of the firecrackers started to sync up with something heavier, something deeper. It took us way too long to realize that the rhythm wasn't festive anymore. It was mechanical. By the time we realized the truce was a lie, the street outside was already a river of red. I remember looking out the window and seeing a man I'd seen every day for a week, a local vendor who sold us fruit, standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't selling anything today. He was holding a heavy rifle, and he was methodically firing into the front door of the house across from us. The look on his face, it wasn't even anger. It was just this blank, empty stare, like he was doing chores. That's the true crime of it all. The people you think you know, the ones who smile at you in the daylight, they're the ones who know exactly where you sleep. We didn't have time to grab anything. The front gate of the villa was kicked in with a sound that felt like it cracked my ribs. We scrambled into the crawl space beneath the floorboards, a damp, narrow gap that smelled like rot and old earth. There were 4 of us packed in there, chest to back, trying not to breathe. Through the cracks in the wood above us, I could see the flickering light of the lantern swaying in the breeze. And then I saw the boots. They weren't military boots at first. They were sandals. Dirty, mud-caked feet moving with a terrifying purpose. I watched as the blood started to drip through the floorboards. It didn't splash, it was too thick for that. It just kind of oozed, heavy and dark, landing on the shoulder of the guy next to me. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at the dark stain spreading across his shirt, his eyes wide and vacant. From above, we heard the screaming start. It wasn't just the sound of people being killed, it was the sound of them being hunted. I heard the family that lived in the back suite, a young couple with a little girl. I heard them being dragged across the floor. The sound of skin sliding against wood is something you never forget. It's a wet, friction-filled noise. There was a wet thud, then another, followed by a silence that was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of my lungs. I stared through a gap in the wood and saw the little girl's hand. Just her hand. It was laying limp on the floor, and someone was stepping on it as they moved through the room. They didn't even notice. They were just walking back and forth, tossing things around, looking for us. One of the men stopped right above my face. I could see the dirt falling from the soles of his shoes. I could see the rusted tip of the blade he was carrying, dripping a slow, steady stream of something visceral onto the dirt right next to my ear. The smell was the worst part. It wasn't just the gunpowder anymore. It was the smell of opened bodies. It's a metallic, sickly sweet scent that coats the back of your throat and makes you want to gag, but you can't. If you make a sound, you're done. So you just lie there, inhaling the essence of your neighbors, feeling the heat of the fire starting to spread somewhere in the distance. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time doesn't work right when you're waiting for a knife to come through the floor. The city was screaming. Explosions were shaking the ground, sending tremors through the crawl space that felt like an earthquake. At one point, the house next to ours must have been hit by something heavy. The shockwave slammed into us, and the ceiling of our little hole partially collapsed. I was pinned under a beam, the weight pressing into my spine, but I couldn't cry out. I just bit my lip until I tasted my own salt and copper, watching the shadows of the killers dance on the walls above. When the sun finally started to bleed through the cracks, the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a dead silence. The music was gone. The fireworks were gone. There was just the sound of the wind whistling through the shattered windows and the occasional distant crack of a lone rifle. We eventually crawled out. My legs were so cramped I had to drag myself across the floor like an insect. The villa was unrecognizable. The walls were sprayed with patterns that looked like macabre art. The couple from the back, they hadn't just been killed. They had been displayed. It was a warning. A visceral, gut-wrenching reminder that the people who did this wanted us to see what happened when you trusted a promise. I walked out into the street, and the sight was something out of a nightmare. The red lanterns from the festival were still hanging, swaying gently in the morning breeze, but they were no longer the brightest things in the street. The gutters were overflowing. The festive red paper of the firecrackers was mixed with the actual remains of the people who had been setting them off. I saw a dog, just a stray we used to feed, chewing on something in the middle of the road. I didn't look too closely at what it was. I couldn't. The betrayal of that night stayed in the soil. Even years later, when I close my eyes, I don't see the war as a map or a set of dates. I see that man's blank face as he fired into a home. I feel the cold, thick drip of blood on my shoulder. I hear the wet sight of bodies being dragged into the dark. They tell you that time heals things, but they're lying. Some things don't heal, they just scab over, and the slightest memory can tear them wide open again. Every time I hear a firecracker now, or see a red lantern, I'm back in that crawl space. I'm back under the floorboards, waiting for the boots to stop right above my head. I'm waiting for the moment they realize I'm still breathing. And the worst part, the absolute worst part of it all, is knowing that the people who did those things are still out there. They're just regular people now. They're grandfathers, shopkeepers, and neighbors. They're the ones who smile at you in the street, hiding the fact that they know exactly how a human looks. When they're turned inside out, it makes you realize that civilization is just a very thin, very fragile mask. And during that holiday, the mask didn't just slip, it was ripped off. Do you ever get the feeling that someone is watching your house, not because they want what you have, but because they're just waiting for the next truce to break? Because I feel it every single night. I think I'll feel it until the day I finally stop breathing for real.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.